The Kapooka Tragedy is the unbelievable and heartbreaking true story of the events of Monday 21st May 1945. On that day, the Australian Army experienced one of its greatest fears, a large-scale training accident on home soil, which claimed the lives of 26 young volunteer soldiers, many mutilated beyond recognition. Sadly, one inexplicable reason makes this story even more scandalously unbelievable. Australia forgot it ever happened. In memory of those 26 men who perished in the worst training accident in the history of the Australian Army, only to be forgotten, this is their story, dedicated to the thousands of Australian military souls killed during training. When Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies declared in September 1939 that the country was at war, with unprecedented patriotic duty, the country's young men responded. Overnight, extraordinary men living ordinary lives swarmed to volunteer and sacrifice their life for King and Commonwealth. Under iconic slouch hats adorned with the symbolic rising sun of the Commonwealth military forces, they proudly wore the title, Diggers. But not just any diggers. There were laconic larrikins and steely sons of Anzacs, but forevermore an entire country knows them as something else. Rising Suns. Today, located 9 miles from the New South Wales township of Wagga Wagga, is the Australian Army Recruit Training Centre, the home of the Australian soldier. It's more well known throughout Australia by just one local Indigenous word, Kapooka, a place of wind. In 1942, at the height of World War II, the Kapooka Army Camp was first established as the Royal Australian Engineer Training Centre, RAETC, a virtual tent city for more than 8,000 enthusiastic trainee combat engineers known as sappers. For more than 3 months their training was hard, back-breaking work, but it was also realistic and highly dangerous. Monday the 21st of May 1945 was a routine day at the busy Engineer Training Centre. For the men of G Company, they were starting their 4th week of the hard sapper training programme. It was a week they nervously anticipated: demolitions. In the morning, they all marched to the demolitions range where their training would be conducted in a series of underground training dugouts, or bunkers. Constructed from bush timbers, steel mesh, sandbags and soil, they were 7 feet high and 19 feet wide, its roof roughly level with the ground outside. Inside the dugouts, sawdust covered the floor as the men sat around earthen walls on empty wooden ammunition boxes, listening to experienced demolitions instructors. On this particular day, one of the instructors on the range was the experienced, well-respected, and larger-than-life father of 4 from Victoria, a veteran from the Middle East and New Guinea campaigns, Sergeant Herbert John Jack Pomeroy. At lunchtime that day, the men sat around in the shade of a lone box eucalypt tree, eating a hot lunch and sharing stories. On this particular day, everyone down on the demolitions range was in unusually high spirits. It was Jack's 31st birthday. Just after lunch, due to squad changes, 27 men were huddled together inside Jack's dugout for his afternoon lessons. His dugout was located adjacent the box eucalypt tree. During the first lesson after lunch, 3 men sat just inside the entrance of the dugout, making up detonators for the nighttime activity. The rest of the squad sat around the edges of the dugout, listening intently. Having worked in an explosives factory, Pomeroy was considered a conscientious and solid instructor for the trainee sappers. They were young, mostly teenagers. Before joining the army, they had worked as farmhands, tractor drivers, motor mechanics, milk factory workers, timber cutters, and barbers. Jack soon commenced his familiar Monday afternoon lesson, Lesson 5, fixing and firing a small slab of explosives. But on this particular day, something was different about his lesson. Jack started his lesson standing next to a wooden box containing a deadly cache of explosives. 100 pounds, 45.4 kilograms, of monobel and 10 pounds of gelignite, plus a large quantity of detonators and fuses. Having explosives and detonators in the same dugout was routine. It was not considered risky because it seemed inconceivable that the detonators could accidentally come into contact with the explosives, which were stored on the far side of the dugout. On this day, Pomeroy began his talk on the preparation of hand charges, demonstrating how to cut and crimp safety fuse wire, attach it to a detonator, then place the detonator into a tennis ball-size plug of monobel. As he spoke, another instructor, Sergeant Kendall, left the dugout to complete a task. At 2:45 p.m., there was a single blinding flash in Jack's dugout. The thunderous explosion shook the entire camp. Something had gone disastrously wrong. From the location of Jack's overcrowded dugout, plumes of dust and debris reached high into the sky. Sergeant Kendall was walking back towards the dugout when the massive explosion and a wave of searing heat knocked him to the ground. He knew what had happened. From my position on the ground, I could see that the roof of the dugout had caved in, and a portion of a man's body had been blown to a position close to me, Kendall recalled at the time. Elsewhere across the camp, soldiers assumed the blast was a part of training, and it took several minutes for them to register what had happened. Instructors working nearby heard the explosion and felt the earth groan beneath them. One soldier, Sergeant Roy Tafe, saw smoke and debris filling the air above the dugout and raced towards it. A grisly scene confronted him, checking the mass of bodies for signs of life. An eerie silence descended over the scene. By a sheer miracle, he found 18-year-old sapper Alan Bartlett from South Australia in an upright position, embedded into the southwestern wall by the force of the blast, suffering only minor injuries, but clearly alive. Alan would later become the tragedy's sole survivor. Once word got out, a fleet of ambulances raced to the scene. Everyone imaged the worst. When the first rescuers arrived, what they saw haunted them for a lifetime. Tangled amongst the twisted pile of timber, steel mesh and sandbags was the mutilated and gruesome remains of more than 20 young men. The explosion was so powerful that it mutilated some of the young men's bodies beyond recognition. 20 men had been killed instantly. 2 were barely clinging to life, and 4 men were missing. Jack Pomeroy and 3 of his brave young men were nowhere to be found. Their remains were never identified or recovered. 2 other soldiers in the dugout were dragged from the wreckage alive. Suffering horrific wounds, 36-year-old Bill Reed and 26-year-old Ivan Merritt were barely alive and not expected to survive the night. They died 2 hours later from their horrific wounds. 7 intact bodies were found seated against the wall with their arms folded. They looked like men of 80, their faces ash grey, was how one rescuer described them. The others were blown to bits. According to the official inquest transcript, 19 soldiers were identified by identity discs. The remaining 7, being unrecognizable, were identified through personal possessions, including wedding rings, dental records, and labelled clothing, including braces and civilian underwear. Pomeroy was identified by his engraved watch. Having survived the explosion, Alan Bartlett was able to give evidence to the subsequent military inquiry from his hospital bed. He described how Corporal Cousins, one of the instructors, was holding a handful of detonators with blue fuses attached before the blast, but was on the other side from where the explosives were. Bartlett said he had turned to say something to my mate, and the next thing he recalled, he was being dragged out of the hole. The army was stunned by the carnage and released a short statement that day saying 26 men had been killed in an explosion and promised an immediate inquiry. That night, after hours of painstaking and heartbreaking identification, the senior army medical officer certified the cause of death as blast injuries. Authorities finally confirmed that 2 instructors and 24 trainees were deceased. Understandably, next of kin needed to be notified of the horrific tragedy. Unfortunately, authorities were reluctant to release the names of the victims until all next of kin had been notified. Therefore, 8,000 anxious families around Australia waited for the news that their son wasn't one of the 26 unfortunate victims. But 26 families were soon to experience unimaginable pain and sorrow as telegrams began delivering the heartbreaking news. Their son, husband, father, brother or uncle was dead. Condolences came from the Governor-General, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Gloucester. The tragedy quickly filled the front pages of every national and regional newspaper. The tragedy shocked the nation, coming as it did after the end of hostilities in Europe and with the end of the Pacific War in sight. No one expected such shocking loss of life in a non-combat situation. Just 3 days later, in the largest military funeral ever witnessed in Australia, atop 4 trucks, 26 flag-draped coffins were transported from Kapooka to the Wagga Wagga War Cemetery. They were followed by hundreds of procession cars carrying families of the men and trucks laden with countless flower arrangements. Wagga Wagga stood silent and still as 7,000 residents lined the streets to pay their respects to the unknown soldiers. As the procession passed, men took off their hats and bowed their heads. Women openly wept genuine tears of sorrow. At the sight of such senseless pain and loss, many onlookers experienced uncontrollable grief, collapsing by the roadside. At the cemetery, teams of pallbearers from the Engineer Training Centre, closely followed by family members, met the trucks and carried their colleagues to their final resting place. After individual religious services by their grave sites, a lone bugler played the last post, initiating what remains the largest coordinated internment of Australian soldiers on home soil. With their duty nobly done, the men were laid to rest in peace as deserving warriors. It was the day Wagga Wagga stood still, but in the silence of the day, the eerie calm was only broken by the muffled cries of suffering and sorrow from distraught families farewelling their loved ones.
May 1945, Jack Pomeroy rose early, it would be a long drive. Kapooka had sat on the far side of town. He was off to train the 1st Battalion, and the palm and Galana had rang to the sounds of 8,000 feet there marching around. And the camp, it was the pride of the town, its part in the Second Great War. Down to the bunker they strode in a line, was 7 feet high and was 19 feet wide, awaiting the explosives with which they would train, filled with confidence, youth and bravado. And a flash and a rumble, the trees a quiver, and the lives tumble out like the leaves on the river. And 26 men, they would never come home to loved ones or friends or to family. And the lesson was ready, the stores were in place, the fuses and monobel were prepped and were safe. And Kendall left the dugout to review the wire, and it saved his life that morning. And the ground it shook and it cast him down, and a cloud reached up and the earth fell down, and the parts of men, well, they fell all around. It was one hell of an explosion. And a flash and a rumble, the trees a quiver, and the lives tumble out like the leaves on the river. And 26 men, they would never come home to loved ones or friends or to family. And a flash and a rumble, the trees a quiver, and the lives tumble out like the leaves on the river. And 26 men, they would never come home to loved ones or friends or to family. Wagga remembers the terrible procession. They lined Edward Street in a somber reflection, and 4 flag-draped trucks, what a terrible dimension. So many caskets to mourn for. And the paper opined that they died for their nation, they died for their king and for God's own creation. And far from the war they had come to train for, in the farmland's cold Riverina. A flash and a rumble, the trees a quiver, and the lives tumble out like the leaves on the river. And 26 men, they would never come home to loved ones or friends or to family.
When World War II ended, something strange happened to the memory of this unbelievably tragic story. And when it occurred, the tragedy was turned into one of the darkest moments in Australia's proud, rich military heritage. For the next 50 years, Australia forgot anything ever happened at Kapooka. But not only did the entire country forget. The official history of World War II omitted the tragedy from military records. The Royal Australian Engineer Corps failed to mention the tragedy in its official history. For the families of the 26 men who perished at Kapooka on that day, their loved ones joined a long list of Australian men killed during training. They joined a list of a growing number of Australia's forgotten rising suns. In 1992, thanks largely to the dedicated residents of Wagga Wagga, Australia began remembering that fateful day in 1945. The army erected a small monument to the men adjacent the original explosion site. In 1995, after more than 50 years, sole survivor Alan Bartlett returned to the site of the dugout for the very first time since the tragedy. Finally, with somewhere to mark the very site where he lost more than 24 mates half a century ago, he returned with a heavy heart and a simple message: goodbye. In 2010, 65 years after the explosion, the army held a commemorative service at the site. Attended by family and friends of the victims, a more fitting monument dedicated to the men, and the explosion that rocked Australia was unveiled. Blessed by the Padre, it became a spiritual site of commemoration. Australia now had somewhere to experience the spirit of remembrance, not only for the 26 victims, but an understanding of the selfless sacrifices of 26 remarkable and resilient families. In 2025, marking 80 years since the tragedy, the Wagga Wagga Council unveiled a commemorative plaque and new street signs in the Special Activation Precinct, named in honor of those who lost their lives or were injured in the Kapooka Tragedy. The special ceremony was held on Wednesday, 21st May 2025, to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the tragic event. In partnership with representatives from the Australian Defence Force and the 1st Recruit Training Battalion Kapooka, Council officially revealed Pomeroy Drive, formerly Merino Road, Cousins Road and Linthorne Road, newly named in honour of 3 of the 26 who died that day. In loving memory of Sapper Alan Raymond Bartlett, the sole survivor of this inglorious mess who passed away in 2005, aged 78. Alan's death closed the physical evidence of one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Australian Army. In his passing, finally all 27 men who had gathered in Jack Pomeroy's dugout that sunny afternoon in May 1945 were reunited. Deservedly, they all now rest in peace. After 81 years, amongst the speculation, the allegations of blame, and of course the forgetting, mystery and intrigue still surrounds this ignoble tragedy, and many questions remain unanswered. How did it happen? Who was to blame? How did Alan Bartlett survive? Who were the 26? And how did an entire country forget it ever happened? For the answers to these questions and many more, including the enigmatic rise of Kapooka Camp during World War II, and the life stories of each of the tragedy victims, the first detailed account of the tragedy was written by author and ex-soldier Andrew Johnston in his book, The Forgotten Rising Suns. Their stories matter, their lives mattered, and today, more than 80 years later, we remember them, all of them. Thank you for watching and for helping keep their memory alive. To explore the full story, discover The Forgotten Rising Suns by Brisbane author Andrew Johnston. Visit andrewjohnstonbooks.com or look for Andrew's other work on Amazon. A Time to Return, a gripping fictional story combining the struggles of POWs in World War II and the supernatural phenomena of past life entities, or All Lives Lost. The complete untold story of the 1943 Archerfield air tragedy, detailing the crash of an RAAF C-47, which claimed 23 lives, or Death by Misadventure, the true story of Wodonga tragedy, detailing the tragic bus and train crash at a level crossing in May 1943, which claimed the life of the bus driver and 24 military souls.